Hello, comrades, and welcome back to Ushanka show. Здравствуйте, товарищи. Здравствуйте, greetings, товарищи, comrades. And for those who don't know me, my name is Sergey, and I was born in the USSR. And today we're gonna talk about funerals in the Soviet Union. But before I start my story, we need to learn a couple of new Russian words. The first word is pokhoronka, which means funeral. And the second word is pokhoronka. So that's official government notification. So it's a telegram or letter that notifies a person that your father or your son was killed while being at war or during some other event. So pokhoronka is a really scary word, especially during the military conflict. Now, for those who don't like long and boring videos, I want to say right away that in the Soviet Union we basically didn't have funeral homes and you didn't have to pay for the lot at the cemetery. Some restrictions apply. You need to speak to cemetery personnel for details. Some bribing may be required. You need to bring vodka, cash, or presents in order to get a nice lot at the nice cemetery. And now the story time. And first of all, I would like to share with you guys my own experience with funerals in Soviet Union. Of course, fortunately it wasn't my funeral. But what happened, my mother was actually, I don't know how to say it correctly, she was oops child. My grandma was 40 when she got pregnant with my mom, and that was kind of embarrassing, I guess, back in the day to get pregnant that late for a woman. So my grandparents seriously considered abortion, but decided to go ahead and have my mom. So here we are, and now you listen to my story because they decided to keep the baby back in 1948. So both of my grandparents on mother's side were born in 1907. My mom was born in 1948. So I was quite young when my grandparents became old and fragile, and they passed away quite early. I mean, it was a normal time for the Soviet peasant. My grandpa died in 1982. And my grandma passed away in 1984. So my grandfather Sergey, he was 75-year-old when he passed away in Kiev in our apartment, and I would like to share the story because I remember that really vividly because I was already 12-year-old, 11, because I was born in 1971. So I remember that because it was quite a shock for a young kid like me. First of all, you need to keep in mind that in the Soviet Union, and I'm not sure if the situation changed now, but back in the good old days in the Soviet Union, it was quite embarrassing if your kids send you to retirement place, some retirement home, dom престарелых. Good kids would always take care of their parents. They let them move in and they help them out and take care of them until their death. Another thing you need to remember that due to the huge migration of young people out of country into big cities, a lot of parents live out in the villages while kids live in the city. So in order to help your parents, you move them to your apartment in the city. And that could be a huge challenge if you have like 1 room or 2 room apartment. We're not talking 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 1 room or 2 room apartment. It can be really rough if you bring your parents and then you have 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen, 1 shower to share. It can be pretty challenging. But my parents bit the bullet and they purchased a 3-room apartment. I already shared my story about it. I'll put the link below this video. But in Soviet Union, you had to wait for years, up to 20 years, being on the waiting list to get a free apartment, or you could buy apartment outright. That would be like Soviet style mortgage. It's what my parents did, but it required quite a huge down payment. I believe it was like 5,000 rubles in our case. So my grandparents, my grandpa Sergey, he helped. He gave my mom 3,000 rubles, huge amount of money for the Soviet family. So we were able to afford the down payment and get a nice big apartment. So we did have room for my grandparents to move in when they were too weak to live in the winter out in the country. And life in the Soviet village, there's another thing you need to understand. That was like back in early 1900s for the United States, maybe even earlier than that. Like my grandparents only had electricity and radio in their log cabin. Otherwise, they had to chop firewood all summer to heat the house in the winter. And then house wasn't insulated really well, so it'd be really cold on the cold nights. They actually had ice in the buckets of water in their house inside. So when they got older, it was really hard for them to spend the winter out in the country. And of course, no running water, outhouse, so pretty tough conditions. And we're talking this is like early 1980s. So back to my family. In 1982, my mother decided that it was too hard for her parents to spend the winter in the village. So it was decided they're gonna come and stay with us in Kiev for the time of the winter. So they stay, in a warm apartment, no worries about burning firewood, heating up water, and then they will go back to the village for the summer. And this way they're gonna spend winters with us in Kiev and then spend the summers out in the country. Unfortunately, this move from the village to Kiev, that what actually killed my grandpa. And to be more precise, vodka killed my grandpa. So it's kind of a sad story, but I will share it with you guys. So when it was time to move, so that's probably was like October or November, my grandparents hired a local truck from the collective farm, so a regular truck, and they put some of their belongings in the back, got in the cabin, and they drove to Kiev, which is about 250 kilometers south from my village or my grandparents' village. So everything was going fine, but then a driver said that he smelled vodka in a cabin and he couldn't understand what's going on. He asked my grandparents, and turned out my grandpa, for whatever reason, decided to put a little bottle of vodka in his pocket to stay warm, or just to maybe he was stressed out about the move. So he wanted to have a little vodka along the way, and that bottle tipped over in his pocket and spilled, and there was a strong smell of alcohol in a cab. So of course driver freaked out and asked grandpa to get out of the cab and get in the back, and that's why grandpa spent the rest of the trip several hours huddling among his things in the open under rain, and that's why he caught really bad bronchitis. He smoked, so he's already had bronchitis, and it just got way worse, and that's what was the beginning of his demise. Upon arrival to Kiev, he got sick, and it was getting worse and worse and worse, and on January 6th of 1982, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he passed away, and this is how I experienced the very first funeral in my life. Very, very sad event. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we didn't have actually funeral homes in the Soviet Union. At least I never heard of anyone using one. So everything was going on, all the funeral was going on right there in our apartment. And I was very sad because I was crying a lot, but at the same time it was kind of scary because then there's the body of my grandpa in our apartment. We had him for about 3 days before actual funeral. I'm planning to make a second video about more details of the Soviet funeral and about Soviet different customs during the funerals, but in this video I'm just gonna share my story, what I remember, what was going on in our apartment when my grandpa passed away. So this is what I remember. First of all, they covered all the mirrors in our apartment, so we had, I don't know, like couple mirrors, and everything was covered with black fabric. They put a shot of vodka and a piece of bread right next to one of the mirrors. Then they put a glass of water by the window. So these kind of things were done while the body of my grandpa was in our apartment. What was really disturbing for me is that I wasn't a teenager yet, right? I was 11, is, well, first of all, that sweet smell, because as I said, grandpa's body was in our apartment for 3 days. And I recall on the second or third day, you started smelling this faint, sweet smell. And I guess there was a decaying body. Then grandpa's nails were still growing. His facial hair was still growing. So that was really spooky. I also recall my mom calling a doctor. So we had a doctor coming and visiting my grandpa. So she came and she confirmed the death, and she wrote spravka, special paper, that she confirmed that was a natural death, so like he didn't get killed. Then my mom had to find the cemetery with the lots available. And you probably know by now that Kiev is a big city. It's like 3 million people. So there's a lot of people die every day. So you need to find a cemetery with the lots available, and then you need to get one of those lots. So then, of course, relatives were coming, family friends were coming. So there was a lot going on in our apartment, a lot of traffic. So that was really stressful. And then finally, when we had actual funeral, we took Grandpa in a coffin outside, and there was a special bus already parked there from the cemetery. Quite often, people also had small orchestra, so you could find people, musicians, and they always looked rough, like they're alcoholics, and they will play music while people carry the coffin towards the bus. So bus wouldn't park right next to the building. It'll park a little bit far away, so you have this little, I don't say parade, but like a funeral walk-in. So people will walk for about 200-300 feet carrying the body, and the orchestra will play music, or in our case we don't have orchestra, people just quietly walk through. Sometimes I believe you can hire special ladies who will cry, walk in the front of the group, and they'll be crying, and then they put the coffin in the back of the bus, then people get on the bus, and then you ride away to cemetery. And by the way, they always played exactly the same tune. I believe it's called Funeral March by Mendelssohn. So if I'm somewhere walking on the streets of Kiev and I hear this music playing, there's a funeral going on somewhere close by, and quite often people just kind of race that way to watch it. So there was exactly the same music played every single time by orchestra during the funeral. Okay, so that was the story about my grandpa's death. And in my next video, I'll get more into details about funeral traditions and customs in the Soviet Union. I hope you liked this video. Can't say it enjoyed because it's kind of sad. And we'll talk to you soon. Hello, dear friends. Today we'll talk some more about funerals in the Soviet Union. But first of all, I would like to thank all of you who expressed their condolences about the death of my grandfather, Sergey. Thank you so much, guys. It was very nice of you. But before we get on the topic about different funeral traditions in the USSR, I'll need to tell you another sad story. It's a story about my grandmother, Maria, who was born in 1907, just like my grandpa, and who passed away in 1984, 2 years after my grandpa Sergey passed away. The worst part of this story is that I kinda killed my grandma. So we need to go back to 1982. After my grandpa passed away in January of 1982, Grandma lived with us over the winter and spring, and then she went back to the village, and I went with her to spend my summer break. So in 1982, I was 11 years old. My grandmother changed quite a bit after the death of her husband. Although I recall she was famous for always kind of dismissing the whole idea of marriage, her famous saying was "Замуж, замуж, поцелуй меня в сраку," which you can translate like "marriage, marriage, kiss my ass." But after the death of her husband, she was definitely lost. Another curious detail, although I grew up with my grandparents in the village, and I was already telling the story that my mom brought me first time to the village when I was 9 months old. So actually I learned to walk in the village. My grandparents were there. My parents were in Kiev working. Only in Kiev, many years later, so in the early 80s, when I was walking grandma around showing her the city, I realized that she didn't know how to read or write. So for me, a young pioneer, it was quite a shock to discover that my own grandmother would be looking at the sign at the store that says "Молоко," milk, and she wouldn't know that it means milk. So I remember when I was telling her, like, yeah, this is what they sell milk, it says "Молоко," and she was looking at me and was like, I can't read. And I was like, what? So now we need to go back to the village up north, Ukraine, Chernihiv region. And I had a couple videos about dangerous games of Soviet children, and I was playing those dangerous games quite a bit. If you didn't watch those videos yet, I strongly recommend, because it kind of gives you flavor about what the Soviet kids were up to after they were done with school and they were playing outside, waiting for the parents to come home from work. So one time we were kind of exploring the old barn that my grandparents have. So we had a small barn next to the house. And at that time, since my grandma spent winters in Kiev, she didn't have any more animals. We used to have chickens, a cow, and a pig or two. And that summer we had no animals, so that barn was just staying abandoned. And we found old kerosene lamp that still had some liquid inside. And we took that lamp outside, out of the barn, and we decided to check if that kerosene is still flammable. So we poured kerosene right there on the grass next to the barn. A friend of mine dropped a match into it and whoosh, we saw the bright flames and we were like, wow, this is so cool. And suddenly I hear my grandma screaming. It was pretty late in the evening, so she noticed the flames out of the house and she got horrified that the barn caught fire. And it's like the worst nightmare for the Soviet peasant, because most people didn't have insurance. So she got scared to death. She ran outside, saw us standing by the flames, and she started yelling at us. And I think because of that shock, she had a small stroke and her health started deteriorating over the summer. And by the end of August, she could barely talk and walk. So my parents had to rent a car, to hire a driver, and bring grandma home back to Kiev. And she just wasn't doing really well, and she passed away in January of 1984. And of course at that time I was still pretty young and scared, so I was afraid to admit to my parents to tell what happened. But I think grandma managed to tell my mom, because many years later we had a conversation about her parents, about my grandparents, and my mom looked at me solemnly and said, do you understand that you killed my mother, right? And I felt really bad about it. But anyway, life goes on. We all make mistakes, and we all have to live with them for the rest of our lives. So in this case, I have to bury that cross with me. Although I didn't mean to, I kind of caused my grandma's death. So my poor grandparents, who spent all their lives in the village, which was their home, they end up being in a cemetery in Kiev, which I don't think they wanted to, but my parents decided it was way too expensive to carry bodies all the way back up north Ukraine. So instead of this nice, quiet cemetery up on the hill by the cherry orchard in our village, they buried in Kiev on this busy, crowded cemetery on the outskirts of the capital of Ukraine. But when my grandma was still alive, she was stressing out quite a bit about a special piece of paper called venchik that she wanted to make sure that we use after she dies. Venchik is the long piece of paper with prayers and the images of saint people printed on it. You can purchase those in the church. It actually comes as a package. So there's a long strip of paper that you can cut off, and then a bigger piece of paper has more prayers, and venchik goes on the person's forehead, on the dead person's forehead, and the rest of the paper you put in the person's hand. So my grandma purchased that venchik for herself a long time ago, and as I mentioned, she was really stressed out to make sure that we won't forget to place it on her after her death. So as I mentioned earlier, we had no funeral homes in the Soviet Union, and the state kind of generally stood away from all the funeral business. So people had to figure out themselves a lot of details, like where to get coffin, where to order orchestra, where to get cross for the grave, where to get the special fence, so-called agratka, for the grave, because quite often people wanted to have a special metal fence around specific grave, and so you have to find people who will make it for you, because there was no businesses that specialized in funeral. So you can imagine it created a lot of stress for the family because besides the loss of the family member, you need to figure out who can help you to wash the body, to dress the body, to watch the body, to find a spot at the cemetery, to find someone who can make a coffin. So there was a lot of stress because you don't realize actually how much help could be from professionals who work at the funeral home. The only time when government helped with funeral, that would be in case if some retired high-ranking officer passed away, or if someone was killed in action during some military conflict, then government will help. Actually, there'll be army helping with the funeral arrangement. So for this type of military funerals, young cadets were utilized. A friend of mine who joined the military college to be an officer participated in quite a few of those funerals, and one time he told me a very interesting story. You probably noticed that when you see the pictures of the Soviet cities, you see always the tall apartment buildings, like they call them projects here in America. So that time a funeral was like a 9th or the 10th floor of the apartment building. So when they carried the body in the coffin, they decided to save their backs. So instead of using stairs going all the way down, the cadets decided to use elevator. And most elevators in the Soviet apartment buildings were pretty small, quite narrow. So they end up pretty much standing up the coffin with the body almost vertically in order to fit it in the elevator, and then a couple cadets squeezed in there too to go down to the first floor. My friend Valera was one of them in the elevator, and he said at some moment, to their horror, the body started falling out of the coffin. So one of the guys pushed it in the chest to stop the fall, trying to push it back inside of the coffin. And at that moment, the dead person's mouth opened and this nasty liquid just poured right off his mouth and on this guy's clothing. My friend got lucky. He said he kind of jumped away, so he got lucky, but the other guy got this nasty stuff all over him. And by the way, one of the very important rules when you carry the dead body out of the apartment or out of the house, it always needs to come out feet first. We actually have an expression that if somebody died, you say, yeah, he came out feet first out of the building. So that means the person is dead. Okay, so that's it for now. In my next video, number 3, we're going to discuss more in details different rules that you're supposed to follow during the funeral process. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll talk to you soon. Здравствуйте, товарищи. Today we'll try to wrap up the topic of the funerals in the Soviet Union. But before we bury ourselves into this topic, we need to learn a new Russian word. This word is shabashka. Shabashka. And the origin of this word is quite interesting. So shabashka means some kind of side income or side work. So for example, if you work at the welding factory, maybe you on the side make some kind of fences for the graves. So that's your shabashka. People order you a fence, you weld it quietly so the management don't see it. Then you carefully carry it out of factory and you sell it to the side that this is your shabashka. Or if you're a musician that plays trombone or drums or tube and you have a couple of friends that once in a while hire out to be an orchestra for the funeral, so this is also your shabashka. So shabashka came from the word shabash, which has two different meanings. One is original from Sabbath, so it's a Jewish word for Saturday. And for some reason in Russian language, shabash also means a gathering of witches. So shabashka from shabash, it's your work on a weekend, on Sabbath. So you do something on a day that you're not supposed to work in order to earn extra money. Shabashka. The most of the traditions for the funerals in Soviet Union came from Russian Orthodox Church. So even the Soviet state was officially anti-religious, atheist state. Most funeral traditions had their deep roots in the Orthodox Church. And now let's take a look at several rules for the funerals in the Soviet Union. Number 1. It is preferable to have a funeral performed on the 3rd day after the death. But of course it all depends on the circumstances. For example, when my grandfather and my grandma passed away, they were old, sick, so we didn't have to take them to morgue to perform, and I'm gonna butcher this word, autopsy. But if it's a person died as a young person or it's their 50s, so they need to actually be taken to the morgue to check, make sure it was a natural death. So of course, if you died on Friday afternoon, you have to wait all the way through the weekend to take a body to morgue on Monday and wait for performing the, again, autopsy, then take the body back and prepare for funeral, so they can delay the actual funeral for more than 3 days. Number 2, there should be no funerals on Sundays or on a New Year day. Number 3, after person died, all the mirrors should be covered with the black fabric, which I remember was done in my apartment when Grandpa passed away and Grandma. And also all the clocks must be stopped. And in such condition, they should remain for 40 days. Number 4, that's a tough one. You cannot leave the body by itself in a room, even for a minute. So there should be always someone in the room next to the dead person. Now, pregnant women, children, or women that have period are not allowed to do that. But there always should be someone there, day or night, next to the body. Number 5, you're not allowed to carry the body out of the house or apartment before noon or after the sunset. Number 6, body can be washed only during the daylight, and pregnant women or the ones that have period not allowed to perform washing of the body. Number 7, no laundry can be done, no house cleaning or even dusting can be performed while there's a dead body in the house. Number 8, on the forehead of the dead person, as I mentioned in my previous video, there must be eventual, a long strip of paper with the prayers and the images of the holy people. Deceased person must also have his personal body cross. I don't know how to translate it correctly. So the нательный крестик. If you notice, a lot of like Orthodox people, Russian Orthodox people, they wear on a chain a little tiny golden or silver cross. So that cross must be on the person, on a deceased person. Along with the body, the coffin must contain deceased person personal belongings like his glasses, his watch, and so on. So it's kind of like for the future archaeologists, there'll be a happy time because according to the rules, all the personal items should be included with the body. Number 9, that one is kind of interesting. So the hands of deceased person must be crisscrossed on his chest, and the right hand should be on the top of the left hand. So if you look at the pictures of Stalin when he died, definitely it wasn't done in the right way according to the religious beliefs. Number 10, during the funeral and even when the deceased body is in the house, women must have their heads covered. Doesn't say anything about the guys, but I think you're supposed to, according to Russian Soviet traditions, you're supposed to remove your hat when you enter the building or enter apartment for men. But in case of the funeral, women must have their heads covered. Number 11, the body must be removed out of the house legs first. And the reason for it, so the deceased won't be able to find his way back. This is kind of interesting. And the blood relatives are not allowed to carry or the lid or, and I forgot the word for grob, coffin. Here you go. Sorry about that. So blood relatives cannot carry coffin or the coffin lid. Now, due to the tiny, small sizes of Soviet apartments, especially Khrushchevka, as well as small size of staircases and landings, there could be quite a project try to remove the body of deceased out of the apartment and outside. So sometimes they actually had to carry separately coffin from the body, and then the lid will be waiting outside. Or as I mentioned in my previous story, if you try to fit it in an elevator, you can get in trouble too. Now, once you have a coffin with deceased outside, you have a bus usually parked about 200 to 300 meters away from the building, and usually the bus will be PAZ 652, which had a little back door, so you can slide the coffin inside. So there's the time for shabashniki, for people who will earn extra money by doing little music orchestra. So they will slowly walk, carrying the coffin and playing the music, and then they slide the coffin into the bus, and here we start driving towards the cemetery. And of course, people usually by this time talk to different shabashniki workers who will make a metal fence for the gravesite as well as the metal cross. So you specify what size, what color paint, so everything else, so that will be already on order and maybe even ready to go waiting at the cemetery. Interestingly, there is quite a few superstitions relating to situation when you, for example, walking towards the grocery store and suddenly you walk upon the funeral procession. So it's actually, if it happens, you're supposed to stop, if you're a guy, you remove your hat and you're supposed to cross yourself. And generally, it's actually considered like for a good luck if you stumble upon funeral procession, except the cases if you do something stupid like you cross right in the front of procession, so you cross their path. That means you can get terminally ill and die yourself, so you don't want to do that. You have to wait till the procession pass you. And also, if your route is same direction as the funeral, you might want to change, because if you go the same path as the funeral, that means you're kind of heading towards your own funeral. So there's two things you're not supposed to do: cross the path or walk the same path as the funeral procession. Otherwise, you'll be just fine. And now we're back to the rules of the funerals. So once you arrive to the cemetery, rule number 12, that everyone that participates in the funeral procession must scoop a handful of dirt and toss it into the grave after coffin is lowered. Also, you're not supposed to visit other graves, other of relatives or friends while you're at the cemetery on the day of their funeral. Well, and now it's time to learn a new Russian word, pominki. Pominki is a celebration. We can't really call it a celebration, but once you're done with the funeral and body is buried at the cemetery, everyone comes back to the house and they have a meal to say goodbye to the deceased, and it's called pominki. During pominki, the only type of alcohol allowed to be consumed is vodka. No wine, no beer. People don't clank glasses like the usually Russians do when they drink vodka to say, cheers, na zdarovye. You just quietly drink your vodka. And also during pominki, that's when you pour a glass of vodka for the deceased person and you set up a piece of bread on top of it. So that's the tradition of pominki. Next day, after pominki in the morning, you're supposed to bring whatever leftovers of food and vodka back to the cemetery, and you put some of that food on the grave. A shot of vodka, a little bit of food, but then you give the rest of the meal to the workers that help to bury the body. So that's kind of saying goodbye one more time to the deceased, and also give a small treat to the workers, which of course they never mind to have extra free vodka. Rule number 13. For 7 days after the death of the person, you're not supposed to take anything out of that apartment or house. And any belongings of the deceased must be kept for 40 days. You cannot get rid of any clothing, any other items of the deceased person for 40 days. Number 14. For 6 weeks after the funeral, there should be a plate of food and a glass of water set up on the windowsill. So I guess that's for the deceased spirit to have some snacks. Now back to Paminki. So after saying goodbye at the day of the funeral, now only relatives gather together again on the 9th day of the death. And this is kind of the idea that the spirit of the deceased kind of traveling around the world for 9 days before going up to heaven. After that, they gather again together on the 40th day, 40. This is when the spirit up there in heaven and decision made about him going to heaven or hell. And the last final Paminki happens on the anniversary when it's 1 year since death. And after that, we're pretty much done to do Paminki for the deceased person. Well, I'm afraid you guys are dead tired listening to this long, boring video about funerals. So we got a couple more things to talk about. Back to the graves. I was told that usually in the areas where there's high demand, like big cities, for people to be buried all the time, it's usually 50 years and then the cemetery will be reused again. So you populate the cemetery, it's full. For 50 years, it's untouchable. Then, if the graves are not being attended by relatives, they can rebury new people atop. Now, out in the country, in the villages, it's not the case because there's plenty of land and the old cemetery is just getting abandoned, overgrown, and they just popped a new cemetery right next to it. So that's kind of the case what we have in the village in the northern Ukraine. Another thing which is really important for people from the Soviet Union, like my mom, is to have a cemetery located somewhere in a nice, quiet location. And when my mother came here to the United States to visit us quite a few years ago, she was very disturbed to find out there's so many cemeteries right next to the busy highways. She was really horrified because she said dead people don't have a peaceful rest here because they have cars and trucks or rail or trains right next to it, creating noise all day, all night. Okay, comrades, I hope you enjoyed this video. Well, if you can enjoy such topic, and we'll see you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.